Hey, sister students, today we're going to be talking about the Civil Rights Movement. So in the 1950s, at home, one of the major developments that's occurring is African Americans fighting for equal rights in the United States. And the success of this movement that's known as the Civil Rights Movement of the 50s and 60s, and even later into the 70s, the success of that movement led to other movements getting started and creating equal opportunities for women, for other ethnic minorities, and people that are disabled. And so this is one of the first really civil rights movements, giving people equal access and paving the way for other movements to occur. So with the civil rights movement, we're going to actually start before the 50s. We're going to go back to the 40s. And some major important things occur in the 40s, late 40s. So we have 1947. This is a year that's important because Jackie Robinson becomes the first African-American baseball player to break what's called the color barrier. So he plays in the major leagues, first African-American player to play in the major leagues in baseball. And then President Truman, who's president at the time, he actually is fighting for civil rights. He thinks there should be civil rights, and so he proposes some laws to Congress, but Congress is not ready to act at this point, and they vote down the laws that he's proposing. But what Truman did do in 1948, he went around Congress, and he used his power as president to issue an executive order. So he desegregates the military, does this without congressional approval, and he ends discrimination in government hiring. So you can no longer discriminate based on race for government jobs. So this is what Truman could do. Even though Congress was not with him, he acted alone and did get some civil rights things done in the 40s. Okay, I want to talk about one of the most landmark Supreme Court decisions in our country's history. It's called Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. But before I tell you what that was, I want to give you some background info. I want you to know the court case Plessy versus Ferguson. This was all the way back in 1896. But what Plessy versus Ferguson said is that you can have separate but equal facilities. So this made segregation legal. It said you can have a separate facility for African Americans and for white Americans as long as both are equal, in quotes. What ended up happening is things were not equal. Many African American schools were inferior to white schools. And so in the 1930s, the NAACP actually began trying to challenge this doctrine in court and get it thrown out. And so another court case that gives us a little background, 1950, this is still before Brown versus Board. This involves a law school, University of Texas Law School. Now there's a man named Herman Sweat. He was an African-American law student, and he was kept out of UT Law because of the color of his skin. And in order to get around not allowing him in, they actually created a separate law school for African Americans. So they're trying to do separate but equal. Well, the Supreme Court ruled in Sweat v. Painter that the two schools were not equal because there was differences in the facilities. He was isolated from white students. He did not get the same opportunities as white students. And so Sweat v. Painter forced the integration of upper graduate course level law school. So this brings us to Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Basically what had happened was there was an African American child who was forced to be segregated to an all African American school, which was further away from her house than the white school. And so they challenged this ruling based on the fact that she had to travel farther and it was harder for her to get to school, and she wasn't getting as good of an education because she had been denied admission to the all-white public school that was near her home. So this made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that African-American children were not getting equal treatment under the law by having segregation of public schools. And so Brown versus Board of Education outlaws the segregation in public schools. It says that separating races is inherently inferior because it sends a message to African American students that they're not good enough, They don't have the same materials, they don't have the same quality of education, and so therefore, separate but equal is done in the public school system. Schools must be integrated, says Brown versus Board. So still talking about Brown versus Board, you might see it referred to as the Brown decision, or Brown v. Board, or Brown versus Board of Topeka, Kansas. All that's the same thing. Now we have Thurgood Marshall. He's the lawyer that's arguing the case for the NAACP. You've got Earl Warren, who writes the decision of the court, and this overturns Plessy v. Ferguson. So Plessy v. Ferguson is no longer in law. So racial segregation in schools is no longer legal. So Brown v. Board, this is a key part of the civil rights movement because it gives equality in the public school system. So, and it says that the Supreme Court says that desegregation should occur with all deliberate speed. Now, what's going to happen with this term is it does not have a set date. It does not tell when this must occur. So the southern states, southern schools, they're going to stall. They're going to move forward very slowly. This wording allows these southern states and southern school districts to kind of get around integrating for a long, long time. So Brown v. Board, it was a big gain for the civil rights movement. But even though the schools have been desegregated, there was still what was called Jim Crow laws in effect. And these laws made things separate. It prevented African Americans from sharing any beaches or theaters or restaurants or water fountains or anything with whites. And so it still had segregation in the South. All right, now we're going to move into the Montgomery bus boycott. So to try to end these Jim Crow laws, there was boycotts, there was different things, different movements to try to end the unfair practices of desegregation in the South. And so in 1955, December, Rosa Parks, who was a member of the NAACP, she got on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and refused to give up her seat to a white person when they boarded. And so due to the laws in place at the time, the Jim Crow laws, the racial segregation, she was arrested and put in jail. Here's her mugshot, a very famous picture. And so local leaders began the bus boycott of the Montgomery bus system. So they tried to get all African Americans to stop using the bus system and try to hurt them economically until the bus system would end the practice of racial segregation. Now, the leader of this movement, one of the leaders was MLK Jr. He's going to become a main figure in the civil rights movement. We'll see him again. This boycott lasted 11 months, and ultimately the African American leaders took this case to federal court, and the court ruled that segregation was a violation of equal protection under the 14th Amendment, and so therefore was illegal. All right, now going back to Brown versus Board, remember that term that the Supreme Court put in there, with all deliberate speed. Now what occurred is the southern states, southern school districts, are trying to delay the implementation of the Brown decision as long as possible. And in Arkansas, this is one of the states that's trying to delay the implementation. The governor at the time, his name was Orval Faubus. Remember his name. He was in favor of segregation. And he actually ordered the Arkansas National Guard to surround Little Rock High School, Central High School in Little Rock, and try to prevent the integration of 9 African American students. These 9 students are known as the Little Rock Nine. And they were the first to integrate the school system in Arkansas. And Governor Faubus, he also refused to provide them protection. Now, whenever they were integrated, there's lots of angry, white angry mobs that are attacking them, yelling at them, spitting on them, trying to get them for integrating. And Faubus refuses to protect them. And so what happens is President Eisenhower, who was president of the United States at the time, he actually orders federal troops to go to Little Rock, Arkansas. He takes control of the Arkansas National Guard. So he takes control of the Arkansas National Guard troops. He sends in federal troops. He actually sends in the 101st Airborne Division. And they attend school with the Little Rock Nine so they can safely attend school each day. Other states had governors that also defied integration as well. And the two you need to remember is George Wallace from Alabama He actually goes to the University of Alabama and stands in the door to try to prevent African American students from enrolling. That was in 1963. And in 1964, you've got Lester Maddox, who he owned a restaurant, and some African Americans tried to enter his white-only restaurant, and so he basically attacks them with an axe handle. He was challenged in court to integrate his restaurant and to let African Americans be served. But instead of actually serving African Americans, he decided to sell his restaurant instead. And he ran for governor, and he was actually elected to be governor of Georgia. The last thing we have today is the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Now, there's going to be two Civil Rights Acts we're going to talk about. 57 is the first one. Now, this one is under the Eisenhower administration. You got to remember that. First one's Eisenhower. The second one's going to be President Johnson in the 60s. But right now, 1957, Eisenhower administration. He passes the first Civil Rights Act. This increases African American voting in the South, because it gives the federal government, federal courts, the power to register African Americans and help them get registered to vote. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was a good idea. However, it was not implemented very effectively. The procedures were complex. It didn't work very well. But it is important because it is seen as a stepping stone to better, greater legislation that's going to come later. Okay, so Civil Rights Act of 1957 is passed. This is President Eisenhower after he signed the bill. This is a stepping stone to much better and greater legislation that will come later.